Hi, I'm Scott McGuire, and today we're going to talk about building a garden bed. This garden bed here in my garden was a bed of green beans last season. We grew some yellow wax beans and some Kentucky Wonder green beans. But now, mid-September, the beans are all gone, and it's time to transform this bed into something else. I think I'm going to be sowing a cover crop here, but what we're going to be learning today is how to actually transform this old garden bed into a new one, whatever it's going to be. Now, the process for building a garden bed, if you were going to carve up a piece of lawn, say, is exactly the same process. It's just a little bit harder to access, cut through the turf and get into that soil to fluff it up. But they're the same steps that we're going to be doing today. We're going to cover clearing the bed. We're going to look at double digging. When is true double digging necessary and useful? And when can you get away with not double digging? How to amend a bed, how to dress it so that you can have really nice, healthy soil for good plants. And how to finish it off, rake it smooth so that it's all ready to plant. So one of the things you need to figure out about your garden bed is how big to make it. Now, the bed can be, 10 to 20 feet is about as long as you want a bed to be, because if you make them any longer than that, then it's just too far to walk to get around them. So I like beds about 10, 15 feet because you don't have to walk too far before you found a pathway out of there, because I'm real big into access. You've got to have access in and all around your garden, everywhere you go. Don't make really small pathways. Don't box yourself into corners. Always leave yourself a way in and out of every place. Because the shortest distance between two places is a straight line. And you're going to be finding all those ways to get around your garden eventually. So I don't like to make a garden bed any longer than, about 18 feet, say. The more critical sizing factor, though, is how wide to make it. My beds here are pretty wide. And the rule of thumb to use is don't build a garden bed any wider than the smallest person using the garden bed can reach into the middle. See, because if you can reach the middle of the bed from the side like this, that's why you can have a wider bed, because I'm a bit taller. But a shorter person, you wouldn't want to have a bed this wide because there's parts in the middle they wouldn't be able to reach. And the most important thing to remember, really, about all the garden beds are the two principles of soil structure that we talked about before, aeration and drainage. There has to be air structure in the bed so that there can be water drainage through it, and the only way to make sure it stays that way is to never ever step on the bed. We want to avoid compaction at all costs. So what we're doing really is bringing air into the bed, fluffing it up, and so we never ever step on the bed, because that's going to create compaction and create hardship for the roots. Now, the other consideration you have to think of when you're placing a garden bed is what direction should it face? What orientation? North, south, east, west. Now, in the northern hemisphere here, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So if you have your beds lined up like this, with the bed facing in the east, parallel with the track of the sun to the west, what happens sometimes is those plants on the south side end up absorbing more sun and creating a shadow for those plants in the back. It's much preferable to have your beds lined up north-south. If you can set up your garden so all your garden beds are mostly north-south, that means that throughout the day, from east to west, there's a complete even exposure of sunlight throughout the total surface of the bed. So once you've figured out how big your bed's going to be and what direction it's going to face, which have already been figured out right here for me, then the first step to building a bed is skimming. That's when you take your garden spade and you skim off all the vegetation that's grown on the surface, whether it's green beans or sod or just plain dirt. Whatever's been there needs to be scraped off. So before I do that, though, I always sharpen my spade. Take my garden spade and a standard file, and one way sharpening, put a nice edge on that. The reason you want a really sharp edge on your spade is because it makes the work a lot easier. It slices through the roots, makes it a lot more enjoyable instead of a blunt, gouging at the earth, you're kind of slicing through it. It's more like a knife instead of a bludgeon. You can't imagine a chef who wouldn't sharpen their knives every day before they went and chopped their vegetables. So I can't imagine a gardener who doesn't keep their spade sharp because they're just making a mess of things when it could be really clean. What I'm doing is tearing up all the roots of the plants as well as all the straw mulch that was in there, and I'm mixing it all together. It's good to stop now and then, stand up and stretch. If you do this a lot, you can really hurt your back. So I've learned through the years, you need to stretch your back fairly often, and then you can do it a long time. All right, that's skimming. So once you've got the bed skimmed, whatever it was that was growing there is now just heaped there in a pile. You take your garden fork and you take all that off to the compost pile. We'll talk about building compost out of this stuff in another segment. But right now, I just want to get this out of the way so we can move on to building this garden bed. Now this soil is pretty dry, so a lot of the good topsoil of this bed is shaking off these roots as we lift the plant material to haul it off. Now if the soil was a little moister, a lot of the soil might cling to these roots. So if that's the case, we'd be taking a little more time to smack those root clumps with our fork to loosen up that soil, because it's great to have some topsoil come with the plant material into the compost, because there's a lot of good microorganisms and things that come with that topsoil. It's like an inoculant in a way in the compost. But at the same time, you don't want to take too much topsoil off the bed itself in the roots of the plants destined for the compost. You want to leave as much of it actually there in the bed for the next crop. I want to be very careful about raking up as much of this mulch as I can. Not only is that really good compost material, but lately in this area we've been having some trouble with earwigs. And the earwigs like to hide out under the straw and under vegetation and things. So by disrupting the mulch layers, I disrupt their habitat and make it a little less easier for them to become imbalanced, too many. Now I don't want to get rid of the earwigs because there's something that eats them. They have a role to play, Even though I haven't quite figured out what it is, there gotta be some reason for earwigs, or else they wouldn't be here. So my goal isn't to try to get rid of them. What I want to do is figure out what's the best balance of them in the garden. And I've been finding they've been getting out of balance, so the strategy I've taken is to do a little habitat disruption. Fertility building in the compost, same thing. Also, the other reason not to leave a whole lot of straw and debris in the bed, because we're going to dig up this bed and redefine it, restructure it, add some fresh amendments to it so it can be ready to grow some stuff right away. We don't want to require that the bed do a lot of breaking down of other organic matter like all this. If we left it around, we'd be causing the garden soil to have to take care of this. What we want to do is put all this into the compost so that all that decomposition process can happen in the compost pile and the garden space is ready to grow some more food right away. Awaiting the final layering in the compost pile. All right, so now we're going to do a demonstration of the classic double digging technique. This was brought over from Alan Chadwick. He learned it from the French intensive gardeners at the turn of the century around Paris, France. John Jevons talks about this technique extensively. So I'm just going to show you a little bit how to do it. I don't always do it in all my beds, but I'll talk about that later, when I think you really need it and when maybe you can get away without it. The first step to digging a double dug bed is to take the area that the whole bed's going to become and dig a trench on one end of it. It's pretty simple. It's not always easy, the soil is hard. Fortunately, this soil has been worked a long time. In a way, this bed doesn't really actually need to be double dug for its own culture, but it's going to make it a lot easier for me to show you. If you have any runner grasses, Bermuda grass, any of those, be sure to pull them out. You don't want those to get in the compost because they'll take over there too. Okay, so now you've dug your trench about a spade's depth, huh? From the top of the surface, you've gone about a spade's depth. Gone down to where there's a bit of a harder subsoil underneath. Gotten all the looser, darker stuff off on top and dug down to the harder layer underneath. Now you set aside that wheelbarrow full of soil for a moment and you take your garden fork and you fork the bottom of that trench. Set it there, press it with your foot, wiggle it down in there, use your weight, dance on it, do whatever you need to do to wiggle that fork down in there. Now you don't need to try to dig up this soil that the fork is wiggling through. You just need to kind of crack it open and then move back a few more inches, wiggle around the rocks, force your way in there. See, now what you're doing is opening up the subsoil, improving the drainage. Now loosening up this subsoil here is going to allow the roots of the plants to travel way down in there, and in some cases even get their nutrients from deep into the subsoil. It's going to allow rain and water to drain all the way through, so there won't be any standing water around the root zone. So after you have the bottom of the trench all forked up, you can dress it by amending it with some horse manure perhaps. Shake a little horse manure in there. Mix it in a little bit. And then dig a second trench. Lots of worms.
Oh, you want to show me those?
Yeah. There's 3, yeah, 4. Now the whole goal of doing all this is to increase fertility, aeration, and drainage in the bed. And like I might have mentioned before, it's never a good idea to walk on any of your growing spaces. Always walk in the pathways and never step into any of your beds. But when you're actually double digging a bed, of course you can break that rule because you're digging the bed. You're making it all fluffy and nice. So a lot of times it's easier to work the thing going this way than addressing it from the side, being careful not to step in it, or you can just get right up there because you're going to be aerating as you move back anyway. Once you've got that trench dug, then you fork the bottom of that one. All right, so you can see where this is going. I'm not going to make you sit there and watch me go every single trench all the way to the end. Let's just cut to the chase. Okay, so after double digging this whole bed, I've gotten to this point here, maybe about 2/3 through, and I'm going to have to ask you to pretend that we've made it all the way to the end, okay? Because that's enough for me. What you do when you've reached the end of the bed and you've forked your final trench is you take all the dirt that you dug out of the first trench left in the wheelbarrow and you bring the wheelbarrow back and you complete the entire process. Okay, that's double digging. Now you want to do that to every single one of your garden beds and you will be guaranteed hugely happy plants. However, you don't always have to double dig in order to have hugely happy plants. This particular garden bed right here, I've cared for this bed for 4 years. This little section was a garden for this household for a number of years before that. I don't really have any idea how many years this soil has been worked up and dressed and worked up some more. So of all the beds maybe that I've worked in my whole life, this one doesn't need double digging. So the way that I actually treat really good soil that I am fortunate enough to encounter is to skip all that extra hard work, and I just do the forking part straight up with the soil itself. I just fork up one spade's depth of fork into little clumps, and I knock them apart a little, pull the weeds away, and keep on going back like that. That's more than enough to loosen up the soil from the crop that grew before, getting it loose enough to dress with some fresh compost or some fresh amendment, whatever, and then get the soil loosened up and ready for the next crop. So once you have your bed all nicely dug, freshly loose and fluffy, it still needs some amending. It still probably needs some fertility to add to it. We're going to talk a whole lot about the nuts and bolts of fertility in the soil building DVD, but for right now, I'm just going to amend this soil with a little top dressing of horse manure. So this amounts to a couple of inches, maybe about an inch or so of horse manure covering the very surface. Now I'm not dressing this bed very heavily with a lot of nutrients and a lot of manure because it's just going to grow a cover crop for the winter. But I want to have just enough boost in there so the cover crop seeds will get a nice launch. So now that you have spread all your amendment on the top of the bed, the next process is called tilthing. And tilthing is the process of mixing whatever you've added to your soil into the soil. Whether you're adding compost or manure or powdered soil amendments, whatever it is that you're going to add, the thing to remember is to always mix in and integrate all your materials as thoroughly as possible with whatever soil is there. That's called tilthing. It's a combination of digging and mixing. You don't need to tilth very deeply, 3 or 4 inches at the most, because you want this amendment here to be right in the root zone of the plants that you're going to grow. All we want to do is mix in the horse manure as evenly as we can with the soil that's there. So once you have the bed dug and dressed and tilthed, everything's all mixed in equally. The very last stage of the bed is raking the bed out so it's evenly flat and smooth. I start by scraping both the sides up to get as much of the bed soil piled up in the center of the bed as I can. Now Now I'm using this landscaping rake. It's a little bit wider than most solid metal rakes, but I really like that extra width. It makes it a whole lot easier to get a smooth seed bed. Once you have both sides raked up into the middle like that, away from the pathways, then you go ahead and even out that center mound by raking off as much debris as you can grab too. Clumps, roots, twigs and branches, all that stuff. Hopefully most of this has come out during the tilthing process, but whenever you rake, you always have little remnants. And we're trying to make the bed as smooth as possible for the seeds. Now I'm noticing also in this bed that it's kind of thin down there. There's not very much soil down there, and there's kind of a big lump right here in the middle. So what I'm going to start to do in my raking is pull a lot of that soil back down here towards the end, so that by the time I'm done raking, I'll have redistributed a lot of that big lump in here back down in here, kind of fill out this, make it more even. Well, that was a piece of work. We started with a bed of green beans that was done, that needed to be transformed into the next thing. We skimmed all those out of the way, took them off to the compost. We double dug this bed, and we forked the remainder of the bed because we knew that was sufficient for this one. We dressed it with horse manure, we tilthed all the horse manure into the bed, and we raked it all out smooth. It's just like stretching a canvas right before you do a painting. Because now the canvas is stretched, it's ready to sow seeds and to create the next layer of beauty in the garden.